It's the #1 issue for Canadians, and that's a fact reflected in polls and certainly reflected in the messages that you have sent to us in the days leading up to today, legalization. And that is the concern about increased danger on Canada's roads and people increasingly driving high. A new survey commissioned by the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction gives us a picture of how Canadians feel about this. And NANUS carried out the poll and released it yesterday. 20% of Canadians, a full 1 in 5, list people driving or working while impaired as their top concern about legalization. So that reality is one of the factors, one of the motivating forces behind awareness campaigns like this one from Mad Canada.
Think you're a better driver when you're high?
Mad's messages are, of course, directed at the wide public, but my next guest is a very individual, very personal connection, not just to that campaign, but to Mad Canada and to the whole issue. I want to introduce you to Gregg Thomson, who is with me in Ottawa this morning, and we're going to share the story of him and his family, and in particular, his son, Stanley. Greg, good to have you on our program today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. It's an important story to hear, so I'm going to let you tell it. Tell me a little bit about Stanley.
Sure, thank you. At the time of Stan's death, he was 18, and you would characterize him like any other teenager finishing high school. What happened back in June of '99 is there was 4 carloads of teenagers, a total of 14 of them, that left the west end of the city. They went about an hour outside to a party to celebrate the end of school. And on the way back, there was a crash, and it was a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, and that crash took the lives of 5 young men, including my son Stan, as well as severely injured 2 adults that were from the Toronto area. And the prevailing difference, or the uniqueness in this crash, if I can put it in those terms, is it was determined that it was drugs only, no alcohol that evening. And this was almost 20 years ago.
And we're looking at pictures of your son at various stages of his life. Drugs only, and specifically cannabis, Greg?
Yes, specifically. And as the details unwound through police interviews, etc., certain boys were smoking in the car as they were driving, both on the way up and on the way back. And in fact, at the point of the crash, they were smoking.
This is 1999, and it still must be hard to talk about and to share these stories. Why do you think it's important that we hear of your son's story and death on this day?
Well, obviously, there's, as you said at the beginning, there's some steep concerns by a lot of people, and I think one of the strongest methods of messaging is to make it personal, and this is very personal. There was 5 teenagers that died that night. On something that was completely preventable. So it's not a clinical message anymore. It's real. It's your neighbor. It's your family. It's the people around you that this can happen to.
I wonder, you're part of Mad Canada now as a result of your loss, and we were looking there at the campaign. Young people like your son, they don't think that there's any risk. We know that from polling and talking to them. They don't think there's any problem with smoking pot, and indeed even driving after having smoked pot. Campaigns, does that get the message to the people who need to hear it?
It's helpful, there's no question, and yes, and I mean, we've got many dedicated agencies to this messaging, but part of the challenge we're facing right now, and I think it's the steepest part of our challenge today, as we sit here on the 17th, is how much people don't know about what just transpired when it comes to drugs and driving. We're so conditioned. We've been studying and messaging alcohol for decades. This is very much a new horizon for us, and even understanding the consumption methods are so different because you can inhale it and you can ingest it, and the effect, the curve on the effects of that are completely different even between those 2 models. So just don't understand.
We don't understand. The science isn't clear, and one of the things you even hear from regular pot smokers is they actually think cannabis makes them better drivers, sharper, more effective.
Right. And I mean, that's very common when I go do work in high schools and everything. That's a very common statement. But at the end of the day, and if I guess I can put it in fundamental terms, the reason you drink alcohol or the reason that you're going to consume cannabis at whatever method is you want to alter yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So you are changing, and it is definitely, you know, proven out about reaction times and concentration, etc. Driving slower doesn't necessarily mean you're driving safer.
Police are going to be on the roads watching for people driving, as they were in your son's case, you know, while smoking pot in a car or any sorts of impairments. They have admitted they're not going to be fully ready yet. They're going to ramp up as this gets underway. But what are your thoughts on the system of detecting impairment with roadside stops and saliva tests and blood tests ultimately, perhaps? Do you think it's going to be enough to keep Canadians safe on the roads?
That's a great question, but it's also a very broad question. I'm going to put it in these terms. Is we haven't solved the alcohol one yet, when you consider that impaired driving is the #1 criminal cause of death in our country still. So now we're going to layer this on top of it. Specifically to your question, the methods we have today, the DRE program, are somewhat effective. But with the newer technologies, I'm hopeful that we'll get to a state where the policing, the frontline folks have better tools in their hand. We're not there yet. Minister Wilson-Raybould put some great laws into effect in June to give them some tools to work with, but on the front line they just don't have those today. So, and the challenge I have with that is obviously is we're learning this on the fly now. As of midnight, there's going to be more people killed on our highways. So, a closing thought as you think of Stanley and tell us his story on this day when Canadian embarks on this new territory. What's your message for Canadians, Greg? Well, actually what I'm going to do is message directly to parents. And if I can in any way, shape or form encourage you to be vigilant right now, to be open, listen to your children. This is real, it's here, and there's some serious risks associated with it. Greg, I thank you so much for sharing your personal story. I'm going to be speaking to 3 young people, and I'll make sure that we talk about some of the very things we've discussed. I appreciate hearing about Stanley and thinking of him today. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much.